Hey guys, it's Carrie, the Invisible Goddess, and today we're going to learn how to make a granny triangle. Here's what you'll need. You'll need a pair of scissors, a crochet hook that is appropriate for your yarn. I'm using an eye hook, a boy style, and you'll also need some yarn. So you want to start by making a slip knot. And then you want to chain 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. You could also use a magic loop if you prefer. I don't. And then we're going to slip stitch into our first stitch. To form a circle. From there we want to chain 2. Then this acts as our first double crochet. So what we're going to do is make clusters. So each cluster is 3 double crochets. So we have 1 because our chain 2 acts as a double crochet. Then we want to go in and make a double crochet in the center of our ring. I like to work over my tail end so I don't have to weave it in. So we make our first double crochet. We make a second double crochet. So we have our first cluster, and then we chain 2. So we're going to make 2 more clusters. So we chain 2, and then we do 3 double crochet into the center of the circle. And there's our third one. So we have our first cluster of 3 double crochet. We have a chain 2, and then we have a second cluster of 3 double crochet. We want to also chain 2. 1, 2, and then we want to put our third cluster into the center of that circle. So 1, 2, and there's our third one. 3 double crochets. And then at the end of this, we also want to add 2 single crochets. 1, 2. So right here where we had our 2 chains, we want to put our hook right there and slip stitch our triangle together. So from there we have done 1 round. So we want to chain up 2, which acts as our first double crochet, and I like to flip the work over at this point. And right here in that 2 single crochet space, or 2 chain space, we're going to put 2 more double crochets to act as our first cluster. And again, you can see this tail yarn is coming up with me, and we're going to work over that. So that's our second double crochet, because our chains acted as our first one. And this is our third. So we want to chain 2 because we're actually on a corner here. It'll be easier to see once we get a couple rows in. So 1, 2 chains, and then in that same space, that same chain 2 space, we're going to add another cluster of 3 double crochets. We're going to chain 2, and we move on to our next corner. I'm going to take that yarn and just bring it with me. So in this next corner, we're going to go over our yarn tail, and we're going to put another cluster of 3 double crochets. 1, 2, and 3. And again, we're going to use our 2 single crochets, or 2 chains. So we're at the corner, so we're going to go back into that chain 2 space and make our second cluster of double crochets. So that's our first, second double crochet, and our third. We want to make sure to do our 2 single crochet, or I keep saying that, our 2 chains after our cluster. And you can see now I don't have to weave in my end because I've crocheted over it. So we've done 1 corner, 2 corners, so we have a third corner left. We have done our 2 single, we have done our 2 chains. So we're going to make a double crochet cluster, which is 3 double crochets. So 1, 2, and 3. We want to chain 2, 1, 2. We're on a corner, so we're going to go back into that chain 2 space. 1, 2, 3. So we're at the end of our cluster, so we do 2 chains, and we want to slip stitch into our first stitch. We've done 2 rounds, but how do we start the third? I like to start on a corner because it avoids you having that ugly line that some granny stitches have. So we're just going to slip stitch. Twice to get ourselves to a corner, and we always start with 2 chains, and then we start our cluster. So the start of our cluster is 2 chains and 2 double crochet to equal 3 double crochet. we're at a corner, so we do 2 chains and we go back into our 2 chain space from the row below. We're at the end of our cluster, so we want to do 2 chains. And here are our first stitches that aren't on a corner. So when you get to a chain 2 space that is not on a corner, you want to put 1 cluster in that chain 2 space. So that's 3 double crochets. So 1, 2, and here's our third one. We want to chain 2 after our cluster, and we're back at a corner. So at every corner you want to do 2 clusters with a chain 2 in between. So 3 double crochet, chain 2, so 3 double crochet, chain 2, 3 double crochet in every corner. Every non-corner chain 2 space, you put 1 cluster plus a chain 2. So that's what we're going to do for the rest of this round. Chain 2, back into the same spot because we're in the corner, and do another cluster, chain 2, so that's 3 double crochet, chain 2, 3 double crochet into the same chain 2 space when we're on corners. Our next stitch is not a corner, so we want to do 3 double crochet into this chain 2 space and then 2 chains. So 1, 2, 3 double crochet, chain 2, and then since we're back on a corner, we want to do 3 double crochet, chain 2, 3 double crochet into the same chain 2 space. So that's 3 double crochet, I chain 2, and we put 3 more double crochet into the same chain 2 space. And then we chain 2. We have a non-corner chain 2 space, so we put 1 cluster there. So 1 cluster is 3 double crochet and a chain 2. So there's our third stitch, and we put chain 2, and then we're back to where we started, so we want to slip stitch into our first stitch, and then we slip stitch to the corner. And we're ready to start our next round. So this is the basic process. Every time you start a round, you do 2 chains and then 2 double crochet into that first chain 2 space, then you chain 2, and you go back into this space to do another cluster. So 1, 2, 3, then we chain 2, and now on this row you can see we have 2 non-cornered chain 2 spaces, so each of those get a single cluster. So 1, 2, 3, chain 2, we put another single cluster into this non-cornered chain 2 space, chain 2, we're at a corner, so we do 1 cluster, chain 2, and then our next cluster. So 1, 2, 3, chain 2, put our next cluster in the same chain 2 space, 1, 2, 3, you want to chain 2, put a single cluster in each of these non-corner chain 2 spaces, chain 2, another single cluster, chain 2, we're back at a corner, so it's a cluster, chain 2, and a cluster into the same chain 2 space. So 1, 2, 3, chain 2, into our same chain 2 space we're going to put another cluster, chain 2, we're on our last edge of the triangle. We have 2 non-cornered chain 2 spaces. We want to put single clusters in each of those. So 1, 2, 3, chain 2, and then put another cluster in that chain 2 space. That's not a corner. You're only putting 1 on non-cornered chain 2 spaces. Chain 2. And then we want to slip stitch to our first stitch. And then we slip stitch to the corner. So I am done with the amount of rounds that I want to make. So I would just slip stitch and cut off here, giving myself enough room to have an end to weave. So I just tighten that down and then I'd weave my end in. So there's our granny triangle. If you wanted to continue, you have the knowledge to do that. So again, every corner gets 2 clusters in the same chain 2 space. Every non-corner gets 1 cluster in the chain 2 space. At the end, you want to slip stitch to your first stitch and slip stitch over to the corner to start your new round. Every new round starts with 2 chains and then 2 double crochet into that chain 2 space. Then you chain 2 and put another cluster into that same chain 2 space on your corners. So you can go on and grow this as large as you'd like. I'm actually going to make a pen with these, so be on the lookout for another video using these granny triangles. Let me know how you did. I'd love to hear about your crochet.